Hello to everybody as we're joining. Happy Tuesday. If you're here to talk about writer's block and burnout, I'm sorry that such a sad thing brought us together, but it goes with the territory of being a creative. So I'm really glad you guys could spend this Tuesday with me. I see people coming in. Hey, Tony, Beatrice, Carina, and Donique. It's so nice to see everybody. So this is a free webinar put on by the B2B Writing Institute, where we help you become the writer they want to hire. I'm the founder, Sarah Griesenbach. I've been freelancing in the B2B space since 2013. And today we're exploring writer's block and burnout. Because when you choose a creative career, you might not realize this, but you're opting into an invisible mental wrestling match pretty much for the rest of your life. And it doesn't always work your real muscles. It does leave you craving carbs. But it often feels like we're working these muscles that we can't see, and then we wind up completely burned out or frozen like we can't move, and then we're wondering why. So I want to talk about that today. If you don't actively stave off writer's block, if you don't do things to keep yourself from being burnt out, it will find you eventually. It's just a matter of if you're an Enneagram 8 and you're really strong and you take challenges as like a fun thing to see if you can do, you'll just burn yourself out in the long run. So this is something I see as universal. So in this webinar, we're going to hear from 3 writers and marketers who wrestle with burnout and writer's block in themselves and in the people that they work with. So their coworkers, the people they hire, even the people they work for every day. And it's going to be awesome. So first, a slight check to make sure the chat works. So I'm going to say hi. I have some links to share today, and as everybody talks, I'm going to be sharing links about the people as well, so you can follow up with whoever is really exciting to you. We're going to be joined by Brooklyn Nash, Carina Rampelt, Christine Gomolka. It's a lot of people who are very honest and really fun to talk to, so I'm pumped. Thank you, Tony. We're checking the chat, and it works. So just a few technical notes, and I'm actually going to go first. I'm in the chat, so I'm going to share some links to help you learn more about whoever's talking. Please don't be shy. Everyone here is just a really curious writer, so if you have the question, I can almost guarantee someone else who's a little more shy than you is hoping you'll ask that question. So you can save them for the Q&A, you can put them in the chat, you can email me later, whatever works. And second, this is really flexible. There will be a replay within a couple hours. It's not always easy to find 2 minutes, let alone 2 hours to sit quietly, especially if you're parenting or caretaking. So if you need to pop on, pop off, we're not going to take that personally. Do not worry about us. Cool. Welcome, Carina. We're just a little bit over. Sorry about that. I'm super pumped because Fenwick is basically royalty around here. So I'm just excited. You're the author of Broetry, which I can't believe it's been 2 years, but that's also very exciting.
The time warp of the pandemic is just, it's so strange.
I think
but
so.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad to be in such great company and to be talking about burnout and writer's block. I think these are things that we all grapple with, all of us creatives, writers especially. And I'm excited just to chat about how we can make the writing process more sustainable, less frustrating, and more fun.
Oh my gosh. I think those are the 3 things everybody desperately wants. So
definitely.
Awesome. I pass it to you.
Thank you so much. I made a PowerPoint because I'm a keener, so I'm going to pull that up now. I'm an editor at Fenwick. So we are a very small studio for uncommonly clear writing and design. That's our focus. And in the past, I've also been an in-house content marketer. I worked for a tech company called Vidyard. I've also been a graduate student at Oxford. So I know something about tackling some very daunting writing assignments and writing a thesis and all that goes into that. And so over the years, I've learned some tricks about and some strategies about just how to overcome writer's block and how I can get myself back into the writing flow. So that's what I'm going to share today. So first up, what is writer's block? How widespread is this problem? Is this even real? Because that's something that some people call into question. So A little research really exists on kind of B2B writers and how we experience writer's block, but we can look to other fields to see where this is coming into play. So a Turkish study shows that 70% of students report experiencing writer's block. And if we look into academia as well, the 10-year completion rate for PhDs, so this is a very large, daunting, usually 400 plus page writing assignment. The number of people who've completed 10 years after starting is only about 55 to 64%. And as we've been talking about, there's a lot of overlap between burnout and writer's block. And that's something that 77% of professionals report experiencing. And I imagine during the pandemic, those numbers have only gotten higher. But does writer's block really exist? The naysayers will tell you that it's not real, it's just sheer laziness or procrastination. You get lovely quotes like this one from Roger Simon, who says, "There's no such thing as writer's block. My father drove a truck for 40 years and never once did he wake up in the morning and say, I have truck driver's block. I'm not going to work." And my thoughts on this is, if that's a mindset that helps you get back into writing, fair enough. But for the most part, pretending writer's block doesn't exist isn't actually helpful. It doesn't matter if it's actually real because it feels real. And writer's block is as real as any kind of anxiety that you might be facing. So if you're experiencing a block and struggling with this, telling yourself that it isn't real, that you should just buck up and pull up your bootstraps and get through it, that's really just going to extend the cycle of procrastination and guilt and shaming, and really just prolong your suffering. So I think it's much more useful to acknowledge it as a real feeling and just have self-compassion for what you're going through. So when it comes to writer's block, what are we actually talking about here? There's different ways it's been defined. Oxford English Dictionary calls it a periodic lack of inspiration. Other sources call it a psychological inhibition or the condition of being unable to create a piece of written work. And while I think these definitions capture part of it, I don't think it shows a complete whole. And I'm not sure any of these definitions fully capture the different nuances of my experience with writer's block. Like, I've had inspirational slumps, sure, but I've also had moments in time where I had a full outline, pages of notes, sources I'd saved, and I just didn't want to write it. And not to mention the very sort of special anxiety that comes if you open up a document and it's just gone completely multicolored with edits from clients and you're just terrified to even get started on that. So I think it's important to really define our terms, because understanding what writer's block is the first step towards being able to treat it. And in that sense, I think it's useful to think of writer's block in terms of different distinct types. So I would categorize writer's block three different ways, or there's three sort of variants of writer's block, at least the ones that I've most commonly experienced. And I'm curious to hear if these ring true for all of you, or if you've experienced other types of writer's block. So the first one is freeze. And I think this is a little bit about what Brooklyn was chatting about. And that's that sense of paralysis, maybe a bit of self-judgment, the feeling that you can't make progress in your writing because you're stuck in this sort of overthinking loop. Next up, there's flight, which is where you're fleeing from your writing. You've got this sort of lack of motivation. You've got the outline, you've got your notes, you know exactly what it is you need to do, but you just have absolutely no desire to do it. And then finally, we have fright, which is the overwhelming dread of a daunting writing or editing task. So that's when, you realize there's something significantly structurally wrong with your article and you're terrified of making that change, or you get a lot of negative feedback and you realize you have to completely overhaul it and you're just stuck in this state of fear of getting started. So let's break each of these down in a little bit more detail. So first up, freeze. So this is the classic feeling like you can't make any progress on a piece of writing. So maybe you're staring at your blank page, looking at your cursor flashing, mocking you, unsure of how to fill that space. Or maybe you are writing, but you're just not really getting anywhere. Like, you write a sentence and you delete it and you write it again and delete it and write it again and delete it. Or you spend ages fiddling with the same paragraph when you know you really need to be moving on to the next part of your writing. And this is really common, especially in the drafting stage for a lot of people. I think what causes freeze is an overactive inner critic. And this is something I like to call your tastemaker. So you can think of your tastemaker as your inner editor. It's that little voice inside your head that's been honed by years of reading and writing, and it tells you what good writing is. This inner editor serves a really important purpose for us. When you're revising a piece of writing, you really depend on your tastemaker to tell you like what's working, what isn't, how you can fix it. But when it comes to writing that first draft and just getting words on the page, your tastemaker can sabotage you. Have you seen the movie Ratatouille? I like to think of your tastemaker as your own like personal food critic, your own little Anton ego living in your brain who's come to judge your work. Except in this case, when you're drafting, they're judging before you're even finished. They're not out sitting in the restaurant patiently waiting for you to bring the food to them. Like they're back in the kitchen, like they're trying your dough before it's baked. They're like tasting your soup before you've added salt to it. So the reality is they're tasting things when they're literally half baked. They're not finished. They're not going to be good yet. And that self-judgment is causing you to become paralyzed. So the solution is you need to send your tastemaker out of the kitchen, get them out of that back room, put them where they belong, and then you can bring what you've created to them once it's time for them to play their role in the process. So how do we overcome this type of writer's block? I think there are 3 strategies that I find super helpful. The first one, just very bluntly, is to give yourself permission to do a bad job. Creating anything worthwhile is an iterative process. And you have to start somewhere. And I really love this quote from Jane Smiley that says, every first draft is perfect because all the first draft has to do is exist. So thinking about your first draft as maybe not a first draft, maybe an exploratory draft or something that gives you a little bit more freedom to realize that it's going to be messy and imperfect and not quite what you want it to be. And that's okay. There just needs to be words on the page. Another trick you can try is to limit your ability to self-edit while you're drafting. So you can do things like maybe turning the brightness of your screen way down so you can't see your text and edit it while you're writing. You're just focused on putting words on the page. You can also do that by changing your font color to white if you find that helpful. It just takes it out of your line of sight and just forces you to focus on what you're writing in the present moment. And there's other apps you can use. There's a really funny one called Write or Die, I think, where it just causes you just have to, you set a word count that you want and a time limit for yourself. And if you aren't like typing at the correct speed, your like screen starts to fill with explosions and it distracts you from focusing on what you're writing because you're just focusing on getting the words out in the first place. And then finally, just practicing kind of mindful awareness, especially if you're finding yourself dealing with the kind of writer's block where you're rewriting the same sentence over and over again, fiddling with stuff you've already written and not moving on to other sections that you need to get to. That could be a sign that you're stuck in kind of a thought loop. And that's where your brain is defaulting to these old patterns, old habits to avoid the hard work of coming up with new ideas. So unfortunately, the only way to get out of a thought loop is to recognize that you're inside of one. So developing kind of your mindfulness habits, whether that's practicing meditation regularly or just the daily practice of recognizing your thoughts and being more aware and more present of what you're thinking and feeling, can be really helpful to getting out of those kinds of thought loops. Next up, our next type of writer's block is flight. And so unlike freeze, which is about paralysis and self-judgment, flight is a form of writer's block that can manifest when you know exactly what it is you need to write. You're not worried about what it is you're going to write. You just have no desire to work on it. Maybe you have pages of outlines and notes already, and you're just not feeling inspired. You might find yourself productively procrastinating by working on something that seems a little more engaging, more fun, or you might just be feeling completely burned out and like you can't do any sort of writing at all. And this is a little bit more of a problem of inspiration and whether you're adequately rested than it is procrastinate or perfectionism like freeze. So what causes this? I think nothing kills intrinsic motivation like the need to produce. I think a lot of us writers, we get into this profession because we love it. We enjoy writing. We love the magic of transforming words or thoughts into concrete sentences and paragraphs and words. We find it really satisfying to move words around and to come up with like clever puns and like fun turns of phrases. But when you add in an overwhelming pressure to produce, whether that's thanks to really tight deadlines or many overlapping projects, or a really repetitive writing assignments, then your motivation can disappear altogether. I personally find this type of writer's block often creeping up on me when I'm faced with really repetitive writing tasks. If I've in a big block of maybe SEO articles for a client, and they all have very similar, not quite the same, but related keywords. By number 3 or number 4, I feel like I'm running out of ideas. Or if I'm overloaded with a lot of like tight overlapping deadlines. And this comes back to what Sarah was talking about in terms of capacity planning and making sure you don't get into that situation in the first place. But if you have, I do have some suggestions on what you can do to get out of it. So here are some strategies that I recommend for getting out of flight. So first up, I really recommend just pressing pause if you can. Removing the pressure to produce can actually increase your excitement about writing. I first heard this writing maxim when I was in grad school. It goes, if you can't write, outline. If you can't outline, read. And if you can't read, rest. And I think that's something that I've really taken to heart and found really helpful. I like that it's progressive. It diagnoses what might be wrong with your process at different stages. So if you're struggling to write, maybe it's that you haven't thought through your structure of what you're going to say yet. And then it's time to take an outline. And if you're struggling to outline, maybe it's because you haven't spent the time, like Brooklyn and Sarah were saying, doing the research, spending the time to really collect and synthesize ideas from different sources. And maybe you need to go spend some more time doing that. And if you can't read, maybe you're just really tired. And what's best for you right now is a nap and taking a break and coming back to it with fresh eyes the next day. So taking that sort of 3-step process and seeing what you could do to help you get back into the flow or take a break altogether. Next, I think trying to buy yourself some time if possible. Obviously, you don't want to do this all the time, and it's better to capacity plan ahead of time. And in the long run, that's what we all should be working towards. But if you've gotten into a situation where you're really overloaded and run down and you've just got a lot of overlapping deadlines, you're probably not going to produce your best work. So taking a break is one of the best things that you can do to restore your mental health and also for the quality of your writing. So I'd recommend reaching out to your clients proactively or the people you work with, whatever your situation may be, and seeing if there's some time and space for you to be able to take some extra time. In my experience, there are no emergencies in marketing, and often these things can be moved. And if it's helpful, you can frame it in terms of, if you're speaking to a client, you can say, hey, I don't know if I'll be able to get this to the quality level I want it to be by this initial deadline. Would you be okay pushing it a couple more days? And then you can leave the ball in their court, whether speed or quality is more important to them. So you could just finish something and send it off to them and it'd be okay. Or see if they're willing to give you an extra few days to get it to the level where you want it to be. So yeah, just being proactive around your communication there can be really helpful. And then finally, making space for play in your day-to-day life. This is something I love that Sarah's doing a watercolor class. Like, that's awesome. But just, yeah, so much research shows that creativity is very closely tied to play. And it makes sense because creativity is all about combining ideas in new and unexpected ways. And that can only happen if you give yourself the chance to let your imagination run free. So doing something like a watercolor class or like word puzzles or reading like the trashy books that you don't want to admit that you read just for fun, or taking part in other creative hobbies like crochet, photography, anything like that can be so helpful in just balancing out your creative energies for a successful writing. And then that brings us to our final type of writer's block, which is fright. And fright is this sort of feeling of uneasiness about tackling a really daunting writing or editing task. I think that kind of dread can come from a lot of different sources. Maybe you're about to embark on a really big project, or maybe you need to complete a very serious overhaul on a piece of writing and you're not sure where to start. Or maybe you've just gotten some really complete and overwhelming feedback and you're not quite sure how to implement it. Yeah, so there can be a lot of things that lead to this kind of anxiety. I think what causes fright, it's the perfect cocktail of having a really intimidating writing task and feeling a sense of self-doubt. I feel like we all can feel a sense of imposter syndrome in this profession, no matter how advanced you are. Fenwick's founder, Chris, who's been writing for years, talks about it. He says, when I get a Google Doc back from a client and I see that it's completely multicolored with changes and suggestions, I'm like, nope, quickly close it. And I think that's a feeling that we can all relate to. I personally felt this really strongly when I was writing my master's thesis. It was such a large and daunting piece of writing that like changing the structure felt like pulling out Jenga blocks and hoping the like entire tower didn't collapse. And so you get stuck in this place where you don't want to mess with the composition because you don't know how you're going to fix it later. And I think these are all very normal and okay feelings to have. I think this kind of anxiety about big writing tasks happens to everybody, but it's when that anxiety starts to spiral into avoidance that we have a problem. So we can't actually resolve this anxiety by avoiding what we have to do. We can only fix it by actually facing our tasks head on. So there's a couple of strategies I have that can be helpful with recovering from fright. First up is just acknowledging your feelings. I think we know that internal triggers play such a large role in distraction and procrastination. There's a really good book that I recommend that I'll pop in the chat later. It's called Indistractable by Nir Eyal. And he talks about how we procrastinate from tasks we know we should be working on because we're trying to avoid pain, essentially. So that pain could be things like insecurity, feeling incompetent, feeling scared that others are going to judge us. And instead of trying to push away those feelings, it's actually more effective to sit with them and acknowledge them. Because when you acknowledge those feelings and recognize that they're a part of your experience, you're much more able to realize that you're having toxic thought patterns and also have compassion for yourself and understand that this is part of the human experience. This is stuff that everybody goes through and you're not alone. Another approach that you can try, I know this sounds cliche, the 10,000-mile journey does begin with one single step. So instead of trying to tackle everything at once, if you feel like you're in a state of fright, try to break down your daunting writing task into the smallest possible component parts. I'm talking like, accept one client change, write a single sentence, like something that is absolutely so small that you couldn't possibly give yourself an excuse not to do it. And the chances are once you've completed one micro task and then maybe another 2 or 3 micro tasks, you'll get the ball rolling and you'll feel much more able to get back into the writing flow and feel confident to tackle that more daunting writing assignment. And finally, think about if your state of fright is coming from a lot of feedback from a client or a colleague and you're feeling quite overwhelmed. And that overwhelm is in part because you're not sure how to implement the feedback, or you disagree with it, or like it's taking things in a very different direction than you envisioned. You're pushing back. That's also an option. You don't always have to integrate every change and every suggestion that people give you. So I would say this really does depend on your deadline and your relationship with the person editing you, but you can always consider respectfully pushing back. And chances are most people aren't necessarily absolutely married to their edits. They're just trying to be helpful. They're just trying to provide feedback. And if you can provide some justification of why you think a different approach might work better, or why you think you should stick to the original version, oftentimes they will be receptive. So don't feel like you have to integrate every single piece of feedback you get if it's not useful to you. At the end of the day, you're the kind of expert on this project. And I think the people working with you trust you enough to trust your judgment there. Yeah, so I know that was a lot, but in summary, I just want to say that writer's block is an inevitable part of what we all experience because writing is thinking. And thinking is hard. And if there's one thing you take away from this, I want it to be that writer's block is a normal part of the creative process and you don't need to beat yourself up about it. Do try to be gentle with yourself. And when you experience writer's block, instead of judging yourself or trying to force yourself to go through things, try and take a step back and see what it is that you need in that moment. So maybe it's that you need to give yourself a bit more grace to be imperfect and be messy. Maybe it's that you need a pause. You need to take some time to regroup and either collect some more inspiration or rest. Or maybe that it's you need to broach a difficult conversation with a client. Maybe they've given you some direction or some feedback that's really unhelpful, and you need to level set with them about how you want your working relationship to be going forward. So I hope that you're able to take this framework and apply it to your own writing practice. So whenever you feel blocked, whether that's you're suffering from freeze, flight, or fright, you're able to figure out what you need to get unstuck. And just before I leave you, I do have a couple of bonus tips to help prevent writer's block in the first place. So even though we might not be able to do away with it entirely, I think there are a couple of habits and practices that we all can use to help make it a little less severe. So the same Turkish study I cited earlier found that students who had a regular writing practice suffered much less writer's block than those who didn't. So getting into the habit of writing every day, making it a regular habit can be really helpful. And the study also found that people who read regularly also suffered less writer's block. So making sure that you're consuming good writing and keeping that well of inspiration full can go a long way in helping you get unstuck and stay that way. So I hope this was helpful. I know we're running a little short on time, but if there's any questions, happy to chat about those now.
Awesome. And I just put that in the chat too. Any questions for people? No, I think that's super helpful. And that 100% accurately diagnosed the burnout I was having and how I've been dealing with it. So I think I at least am convinced you're a doctor of burnout.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much. I'm honored.
And I love the emphasis, like the solution is not to power your way or bro your way through all of this and just work harder and do better and sit longer. And what came to mind is like, if you want a butterfly to fly, like you don't push on it, remove problems from the environment so that they can get up in there and do their thing. So we're the butterfly and we have to be gentle or it's just going to get worse.
Totally. Yeah, for sure.
I love that. I wonder, so I'm going to need some book recommendations after this, by the way.
Yeah.
What trashy stuff are you reading?
Oh gosh, yeah. I read so much like YA fiction. It's super embarrassing, but give me a good YA fantasy series. Yeah.
And I wonder, maybe just before Christine joins us, is there anything in particular that really helped your burnout, or if you've had burnout, besides YA?
Yeah, definitely. I love that you were talking about 4,000 Weeks before, because that's definitely one of the books that really spoke to me. He's got this thing in 4,000 Weeks where he talks about, I think he calls them atelic activities, which is a really fancy word for like hobbies or like things that don't serve a particular purpose, but like different than a hobby, because I think in our culture we have this sort of hustle culture mentality where it's if I'm not optimizing my hobbies, if I'm not absolutely getting better at something and progressing, then it doesn't count. But like the idea that you can have hobbies that you're bad at, that you're just doing just out of the sheer enjoyment of the activity, even if there's no end goal. So doing things like that, like I'm not great at drawing, but I find it very relaxing. So that's something that I do sometimes. Or like the idea of just going on a long walk. There's no goal in that. You're not like trying to optimize your like walking speed. You might even end up at the same places where you left if you went on a long walk, but just like giving yourself the space to really do those things that restore your energy, I found have been so important to me.
I didn't remember the fancy word, but I just took away like leisure lifestyle.
Yeah.
Because if I was really at leisure or leisure, depending on where you are right now, I would just walk and I would not track my steps or take pictures or catch up with friends. Like I would just look around. And with that book, I'm like 2 months into actually walking and just looking at things. And it's really nice.
Yeah, totally.
I saw a salamander once.
Oh, that's so cool.
Like it was really cool.
Yeah, no, I love that. For me, I live in Toronto, really close to the Lake Ontario here, and I love just like going for swims in the lake. It's like there's no goal of that. It's I just like being in the water.
Thank you. I feel like this was super helpful. If there's a request for slides, if Is that something we could get?
Totally. Yeah,
later?
I can share
Cool.
slides. I actually have this all kind of written up as a blog post already, so I can share the blog post that
Yes.
people can read.
That's what we want.
I changed it up a bit for the presentation, so if you want the slide deck as well, I can share that around. But I'll drop the blog post in the chat for people to save.
Thank you. Yeah, Brooklyn says he took about 17 screenshots throughout.
Amazing. Sweet. Okay, I'll share
Well,
both.
thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
If you're still having writer's block, if you're still having burn, we just threw a bunch of ideas at you to try out and see what's going to move the needle. Am I about to say move the needle? Oh my gosh. I never thought I'd say that. Things that will have an impact on you and what you're doing in life, because you really just need small steps forward. Like we think a big wave of change comes and saves everything, but that just doesn't seem to be how it works for anybody outside of publishing in Hollywood. So find something small, cling to it, make that progress, follow up with Carina, Christine in Brooklyn, get some good ideas, follow up with me, inbox is available, and make some progress, because we're in it for the long haul. There's no, unless we drastically change careers or marry rich, there's no escaping some of these problems that we're setting out to solve. Smaller steps, more community, you'll get it done. If you want my help with this stuff, I have two ways that I help people. We have a membership where we're meeting like this, just really casually, twice a month, with a lot of great training and materials in the background, a lot of it focused on the business side of things. And then I'm super excited. On Friday, we kick off the next live round of the B2B Writing Seminar. And that's where we're going step by step and majorly overthinking everything that goes into B2B writing to get you this clip that levels up what you're doing so you can land better clients. There'll be a link to that when I send out the replay so you can check everything out. And we'll see you next month. So thank you all.